Hi there, Steve Coffin here, and today I'm not going to talk about languages. I'm going to talk about Ukraine. I have a number of videos that I have recorded over the last 10 days or so that will be appearing regularly on my channel. I know there are those who will say that I shouldn't talk politics on this channel, but we're not talking about politics here. We're talking about right and wrong, truth and lies. We're talking about people's lives. And I can't not talk about the barbaric invasion of Ukraine by the Russian army, by Putin's Russian army. An invasion that's based on lies. Lie number one, that Ukraine somehow is a Nazi country. Let's just start with that one. The president of Ukraine is Jewish. The defense minister is Jewish. The former prime minister was Jewish. I just finished seeing a video where in 2019, some Ukrainian with a big cross hanging around his neck was complaining about gays and LGBTQ and this kind of thing. And Zelensky, president of Ukraine, said, "We live in a free country. We can choose our language. We can choose our identity. We can choose our sexual orientation. Leave those people alone." Now, does that sound like the statement of a Nazi? Is there a leader in Russia who would say those things? Ukraine is not a Nazi country. It is not ruled by Nazis. There are Nazis in Ukraine. There are Nazis in Russia. There are Nazis in the United States, in Canada, everywhere. There are some Nazis. However, a survey of where people in Europe were asked, would you accept Jews as your fellow citizens or would you be opposed to it? Ukraine was the most tolerant towards Jews. So, Nazi, forget it. The second lie used by Putin to justify his war is that there is genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine. There is no genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine. Russian speakers are at roughly half the population. In other words, native speakers of Russian. I don't know what the statistics are, 40%, 50%, significant number. They are free. There is no genocide against those people. There was a war in the Donbass, a war that was started by the Russians. It was led by Russians, Borodin, Girkin, Bessler, all kinds of so-called volunteers that came in from Russia to foment this war, fed this war, financed the war, provided on an ongoing, continuing basis armaments to this war on the territory of another sovereign country, Ukraine. The war in the Donbass was created by Russia. And during that war, 2014, yes, there were rockets fired from the Ukrainian side into the sort of separatist-held areas. There were rockets fired from the separatist-held areas into Ukrainian government-controlled areas. I have visited the front lines. I have been supporting people there. I have seen the damage that Russian rockets did to apartment buildings and homes on the Ukrainian side, and I can assume that there was similar destruction on the other side. None of this destruction is comparable in any way to the level of destruction that is being leveled at Ukrainian cities today by the Russians. Not comparable. What's going on right now is a massive war crime. Another lie that's used by the Russians to justify their invasion of Ukraine is somehow, according to Putin, the idea that Ukrainians are Russians, Ukraine doesn't exist, it has no history of its own, and so forth. As someone who has, by the way, I'll interrupt this to say that Link has contributed to Razum for Ukraine, and I'll leave a link in the description box, which is a Ukrainian website which is collecting donations to help refugees, to help displaced people, to help a variety of Ukrainian charities. And we will continue to support Ukraine in a very modest way, but we are doing it. We've changed our logo. We've filled our logo in with the Ukrainian flag. We are 100% behind the Ukrainians. Now, and I should add, we're going to find a way so that anyone who wants to learn Ukrainian at Link will be able to do so free of charge. So if you're interested in learning Ukrainian, Stay with us. We're going to figure out a way so that you can access Ukrainian and not have to pay or to be a paying member of Link. We are also going to try to find a way to make Link available free of charge to Ukrainians, particularly those who may have fled to Poland or Hungary or Romania and need to learn those languages until they're able to go back to Ukraine. Now, getting back to, I learned Ukrainian at Link. I became interested in 2014 when I saw what was going on there. And I have read quite a bit about the history of Ukraine. So let's address this other lie that somehow Ukraine is not a country. About 1,000 years ago, in what is today Kyiv, we have the sort of formation of this entity which is known to historians as Kievan Rus, which according to some was founded by Viking marauders. At that time, Kiev was kind of on the border between sort of Iranian and Turkish-speaking steppe people and this large group of Slavs who lived, along the rivers, all the way up north to Novgorod and so forth. Further north, a greater influence of the Baltic and Finnish type people. Further south, as I say, these other influences. But there was one large entity, and I'm not a historian, called Kievan Rus, which was attacked by the Mongols, and therefore various principalities ended up being subject to paying tribute to the Mongols. But slowly the Slavs came out from under this, starting with the Principality of Galicia and Volhynia, which became sort of a beachhead of this recovery of a Slavic identity, and they were Ukrainians. And from there they spread out through other areas of Ukraine. And it was much later that Muscovy also achieved their independence from the Mongols. And then the Muscovites expanded very rapidly over a couple of hundred years to the Pacific Ocean, and that became Russia. But the two histories are different. And the Ukrainian areas, Galicia, Volhynia, and pardon me if I'm not a historian, and people will find things to complain about in my very brief summary of Ukrainian history, but Lithuania then conquered these southern Slavic, sort of Eastern Slavic lands, and subsequently Lithuania became allied with Poland. The Lithuanians were very tolerant of a Ruthenian or Ukrainian Belarusian identity, Orthodox religion, language, and the Polish were less tolerant. And as a result, over the course of several hundred years, the Ruthenian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, they felt that they were oppressed by the Poles, and there was a Cossack rebellion in 1650, I can't remember exactly, and the head of the Cossacks, Khmelnytsky, decided he would throw in his lot with their fellow religionists, co-religionists, the Orthodox Christian Russians, and from that point they became part of the Russian Empire, based on some promises of independence which were not honored by the Russians. 100 years later, large portions of what is today Ukraine were part of Poland, and Poland was then divided by the great powers, Russia, Prussia, Austro-Hungary. And so throughout this whole period, Ukraine was kind of splintered between different areas controlled by different neighboring countries. But just like with so many other national groups, there was a national awakening in the 19th century. I read about it when I was learning Czech, about the Czech national awakening. We know that in the Balkans, the Serbs and the Bulgarians and the Greeks also had their period of national awakening. This was a major current in the 19th century. And the Ukrainians were no exception. And so when Putin says that Ukraine was a creation of the Soviet Union, that's an absolute lie. There was a major sort of national feeling which the Soviets knew they had to recognize in some way. And therefore, and there were wars, and there was in fact briefly a separate, Ukrainian republic. Again, I don't remember all the historical details. All I want to say is that Ukraine, when you read the history, it has an identity of its own, it has a language of its own, and the Russians, unfortunately, not just Putin, but many Russians don't want to admit that this is the case. Now, undoubtedly, when in 1991 the Soviet Union split apart. And there were referendums throughout Ukraine, and the Ukrainians voted in favor of independence. Now, I don't know the background. Undoubtedly, it reflected a number of considerations, including what was happening in Moscow, but they did vote for independence. And for many years after the independence of Ukraine, they were still very much part of the old Soviet political sphere. And with different, with tensions, more nostalgic people for the Soviet Union, people more interested in a Western orientation, and all this while Russia interfered. There was an election in 2004 when Yushchenko was elected president, and he was a Western Ukrainian, I think, and he was more in favor of sort of a stronger national identity for Ukraine. There were people who were opposed to him. He was poisoned, undoubtedly by Russian agents, disfigured his face. This was the first of the Orange Revolutions. This kind of smoldered for a while. Yanukovych came back in, again, with plenty of Russian interference in Ukrainian political affairs. And then there was the Maidan Revolution. It began 10,000 people protesting in the Maidan Square in Kyiv. And they were suppressed so brutally, not only by the police, but also by what's known as titushkis, which are thugs hired by the government to kidnap and beat up the demonstrators, that there was increasing sympathy for these demonstrators, eventually reaching 1 million people. So some people say, well, the Maidan was paid for by the US and stuff. You don't get 1 million people out there by handing out cookies or whatever the Russian propaganda likes to pretend. The net result of which was that Yanukovych fled. He was afraid. He didn't make a stand. He fled. And since then, we've had 2 democratic elections in Ukraine. People say it's corrupt. Don't tell me there isn't corruption everywhere. Yes, there's corruption in Ukraine. However, there's a very vibrant civic society in Ukraine. There are people trying to make Ukraine better. There are people trying to line their pockets, like in most countries. But it's was a very vibrant country. And the suggestion that those people, and the other thing I want to again point out, if you look for it, the speech by the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations, who makes the case that at the end of every empire, there are undoubtedly people who end up in this political, unit country that might have greater affinity for similar people, language groups, ethnic groups in the adjacent part of some other country. We cannot keep revisiting these boundaries. If we did that in Africa, we'd be at war all the time. The same is true with the divisions that ended up between Ukraine and Russia. There are undoubtedly people in eastern Ukraine who feel sympathy with Russia, who may feel more sympathy with Russia than with Kyiv. It's not for Russia to go in there and foment a revolution. It's not for Austria to go into the South Tyrol, where undoubtedly at different times there have been many German speakers in Italy, in that region of Italy, South Tyrol, who would have wanted to be part of Austria. Less so today. But it's not for the Austrian army to go in there and foment a revolution. There has to be respect for, in fact, Russia promised Ukraine respect for their territorial integrity, respect of their independence on 2 different occasions, the Budapest Memorandum and a Treaty of Friendship in 1997. So there is no justification. Whatever sympathies with amongst whatever percentage of the population in whatever area of Russia, whatever those sympathies might be, that is for the Ukrainians to work out. And the Ukrainians, in their response to this Russian backed, supported, financed, and not just financed, but the Russian, when it looked like the Ukrainians were going to take it all back, the Russian army moved in. That's when we got the Minsk agreement. So the Russians have considered this to be their project, and they don't have a right to make a project of independence sentiments in neighboring countries. And the response of the Ukrainian army at that time was not a genocide compared to the Russian approach to independence, an independence movement in Chechnya, where they leveled Grozny, destroyed it. The Ukrainian response was very measured, not without civilian casualties, but no genocide. Not a genocide. Not a genocide like what the Russians did in Chechnya and what the Russians are doing currently today in Ukraine. So I had to make this video because I feel very strongly. I follow it. You know, I think about it every waking minute. I feel for the Ukrainian people, and I think everywhere people have to do everything possible to help Ukraine and to basically, and anyone in Russia who is not criticizing and trying to oppose Putin's war, in my mind, is complicit. Is complicit. If you say, well, stuff happens and I don't know, and both sides and tensions and geopolitical, and Ukraine shouldn't have tried to join NATO, that's up to the Ukrainians to decide if they want to join NATO or not join NATO. The reason the countries of Eastern Europe and the Baltics wanted to join NATO is precisely for what we're seeing right now. Because even in the 90s, influential Russian politicians, I think of Zhirinovsky for one, were constantly threatening the Baltics. Because there is this messiah, this feeling that somehow Russia and its Russian civilization, we have a right to have an empire, and all of this kind of nationalistic, imperialistic gobbledygook is mainstream in Russia. And I think we have to recognize that that's there, and we have to find ways to persuade Russians that there is no future for them as some kind of nostalgic imperialistic power. They are most welcome to be normal members of an international order where every country, large or small, is respected. It's not just that we have to respect Russia. Russia has to respect even little countries like Estonia, Latvia. Unfortunately, there's a strong tendency in Russia not to do that, and that's why countries want to join NATO. Okay, I'm going to run out of things to say here. I feel very strongly about this subject. Please find ways to help. If you can contribute to the Red Cross or Razum for Ukraine or whatever, please do so. I repeat, anyone who wants to learn Ukrainian, we're going to find out ways to make that available free at link. And we're going to try to find ways to help Ukrainian refugees use Link free of charge if they need to learn languages in order to, fit in better into the societies that they have fled to. So, thank you for listening, and from the next videos will all be on language learning.